The Vikings, fearsome warriors and expert sailors. In the 8th century CE, the Vikings explode out of the Scandinavian countries of Norway, Denmark and Sweden and set sail around Europe. They raid and pillage the rich coastal settlements of modern-day Germany, Britain and France. But they don't stop there. These Viking explorers colonize the remote Faroe Islands and are the first people to set foot on Iceland. They even sail as far afield as Newfoundland in Canada.
They hit the North American shore 500 years before Columbus.
And by 985, they established the Viking settlement of Greenland. It is the most remote European colony in the world.
It's this forbidding, hostile territory on the edge of their known world, further north than even they could imagine, and they were the Northmen.
This is one of the most remote locations on Earth, but they make it work.
They rear cattle, sheep, and goats to feed their settlements with milk and cheese. They build barns, villages, even churches. And they sustain their lives through trading one of the most precious commodities of the time, ivory, allowing the creation of some of the most refined art in Europe from this period. For almost 500 years, the Greenland Vikings flourish. But then, they disappear. How could an entire colony vanish? And what was the cause of their ancient apocalypse? The history of the Greenland Vikings begins with Erik the Red. While no account written by the Greenlanders themselves survive, the story of this Viking colony and its founder are recorded in the 13th century Icelandic and Norwegian manuscripts, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Erik the Red.
Erik the Red was born in Norway in the year 950. That's what the sagas tell us. And while he's still a child, his father kills someone, and so the whole family ends up exiled to the back of beyond, to Viking Iceland.
Now, Iceland is basically the edge of the world for the Vikings at this point. When Erik the Red grows older, he follows in the footsteps of his father.
In 982, Erik the Red gets into a fight and kills 2 men himself, and so he's exiled as punishment for the murders.
He's in the exact position that his father was. So when his dad left Norway, he went to the end of the world. He went to Iceland. Where is Erik the Red going to go?
He sets sail and he heads west. Other Vikings have come back before and told tales of land that they've spotted, of a place where perhaps a man could remake his fortune, re-establish himself. And so Erik the Red takes his chance. He sails west.
For 3 years, the length of his exile, he explores the coast of a barren, ice-covered island.
And he spots, in amongst the fjords and the ice-bound bays, 2 areas which could potentially be habitable.
Erik returns and he tells the people of Iceland about this whole new place that he has discovered. And cleverly, he calls it Greenland.
With very little remaining farmland available to them, this new land piques the interest of the Icelandic Vikings.
At that point in the 980s, Iceland was effectively full. So if you're a young Viking man and you want to establish your own household, you can't really do it in Iceland.
However, Greenland opens up the opportunity of your own farm, your own entire estate. For a lot of Icelandic Vikings, it was the ultimate dream. 400 Icelandic Vikings follow Erik the Red. This is 25 ships, and they take the perilous journey across the North Atlantic. Only 14 ships arrive in Greenland. 11 ships are sunk, all souls lost.
Undeterred, these early Viking colonists, led by Erik the Red, settle in two areas. The eastern settlement on the southern tip of Greenland, and the western settlement, 480 kilometers further north and on the western coast. These bases provide the Vikings with an opportunity to explore this foreign land for exotic riches to trade with Europe. A new trading post to grow wealthy from. At the time, it's the most remote European settlement in the world and is by far the coldest Norse Atlantic settlement.
They have the harshest and longest winters. It is not a place that you'd think would be easy. It is certainly not a place deserving of the name Greenland. This should be called cold, dark Deathland. How could any humans survive here?
With no written records left by the Greenland Vikings themselves, it's up to archaeological investigators to uncover just how they could live in such a brutal climate. In 1932, almost 1,000 years on from the founding of Viking Greenland, Oa Usel searches for answers. The Danish archaeologist excavates at the remains of the church farm of Sandnes in the western settlement. As one of the first sites settled by the Vikings, it may offer some clues to their early existence. While investigating the soil at some of the earliest occupation layers, he uncovers pockets of charcoal spread throughout the farm. The settlement experienced large-scale burning. But for Roussel, this isn't evidence of destruction. In fact, it's the opposite. His analysis shows that the early Viking settlers burned the landscape to promote grass growth.
When they arrived at sites, they simply needed to get rid of the scrubs and the trees because grass was what they wanted for their animals. They brought in sheep, goats, cattle. So the first thing they did was burn off all the scrubs and the small trees to get the grass growing.
The Vikings brought with them their traditional pastoralist way of life. And this means that they raised animals for the purpose of subsisting on their products. So milk and cheese. They've got to produce enough hay to keep those animals fed throughout the year.
And it works. They transform the environment into a land they can farm. Over the centuries, more Scandinavian and Icelandic Vikings follow in the footsteps of Erik the Red, sailing west in search of greener pastures. At its height, the Norse Greenland settlement reaches a population of up to 5,000 people.
Most of the Vikings settle in the eastern settlement because of these high cliffs, these fjords. So that gives them some protection from the elements. And the soil is better for agriculture.
But it's still tough. And to survive in this harshest of climates, they need more than just animals to live off. The Vikings need a whole new way of living and a new way to trade.
Vikings living in the Scandinavian countries at this point are pretty much free. They're allowed to trade, they have lords, but ultimately they're in charge of their own destiny.
It's a very different situation to Greenland. All power in Viking society here is held by the landowners, or chieftains. They are autocratic, controlling all of the Viking settlers under them. And they ensure that all work in Greenland contributes to the survival of the settlement.
Viking society in Greenland was quite structured, quite rigid, and very hierarchical. In the harsh conditions of Greenland, it ensured that people could work together to manage their livestock, to build large barns to protect them over the winter.
It ensures the Vikings a steady supply of dairy. When the settlers need more food, they turn to hunting caribou, or migratory harp and ringed seals.
As far as we know, Norse communal sealing was organized with a line of boats driving seals up onto land, onto ice, and quite possibly between little islands with a net strung between. So the idea is to kill a whole bunch of them at once.
This would have required basically all able-bodied men going on the hunt, and then meat would be distributed to all the farmsteads.
At the farmsteads, the women work to sustain the remote settlement.
While the men are off hunting, the women are in control of the farm. Women have to make sure that the animals are fed, that they're sheltered, and that the repairs are done. Without the women, there would be no Greenland Vikings.
A rigid societal structure develops, with the chieftains at the top governing all those underneath, allowing them to survive in the cold climate. But for the Vikings to actually prosper, they need to build an economy. And with the settlements offering very little to trade, they look farther afield, across the frozen seas. Vikings, led by Leif Erikson, the son of Erik the Red, set sail searching for new sources of wealth. 1,200 kilometers southwest of the eastern settlement, they make landfall and establish a new outpost in modern-day Newfoundland, Canada.
500 years before Columbus reaches America, the Vikings make it all the way to Canada. It is beautiful. It has trees. This is brilliant for shipbuilding. It has wonderful grapes growing, so it's called Vinland.
But hostilities with the indigenous people begin almost as soon as Leif Erikson arrives. As more and more Vikings are killed, it becomes harder to maintain the outpost, making the journey across rough North Atlantic seas a lot less inviting. After only 10 years, the Vikings give up any hope of a permanent settlement here. The search for exotic commodities to trade with Europe stops. But with few trees on Greenland, the Vikings are forced to return to Vinland to harvest wood periodically.
The Greenland Vikings were utterly reliant on the supply of wood for shipbuilding and for house maintenance.
And very soon the Vikings find a source of wealth much closer to their new Greenland home.
About 27 days sailing from the eastern settlement, about 15 days from the western settlement, up into the north, the colder, more harsh climates. They discovered this hunting ground that they called Northsetter, which means hunting ground of the north.
It's an area rich in exotic, dangerous, but highly profitable wildlife.
What they find is the most precious thing pretty much in all of Europe, and that is the walrus. The walrus has ivory tusks, and the rest of Europe is desperate for ivory. Ivory is one of the most precious substances in all of Europe. It's up there with gold. It was used by the rich. It was used to make jewelry and precious items.
In the north of Greenland, the Vikings find a near inexhaustible supply.
They would make a perilous journey north every summer to hunt as many walrus as they could.
That was communal as well. It was a question of who owned the ships who could actually bring you from the settlements to the hunting fields, and that was the chieftains.
The entire process required a ton of manpower, and also it required, intense bravery. They are actually very scary animals. The Vikings would take as many walrus as they could. They were cutting off their jaws and their heads, and they were bringing those back for processing back at the settlements.
Recent archaeological finds have shown widespread chippings from walrus jawbones across the western and eastern settlements. The communities work together to process and remove the tusks, before being shipped to Europe via Iceland and Norway from the eastern settlement port of Gardar.
The Vikings living on Greenland had a monopoly on walrus ivory trade at this time.
They carve out a very prosperous life for themselves.
We have some surviving trade records from the time, and one of them shows one load of ivory, which is a whopping 520 walrus tusks. That was equivalent to 780 cows or 60 tons of fish, the same value, which is huge.
This profit from ivory allows the Vikings to ship in goods that are essential for life in Greenland via traders from Iceland and Norway.
They were providing iron, so iron nails and, more importantly, iron tools. These are the tools they were using day to day to survive.
And through this connection to Europe, they import more than just material goods. In the 10th century, the Vikings of Norway forego their pagan beliefs, and Christianity takes hold as their religion. The Greenland Vikings become subjects of the Norwegian crown and convert as well. This connection with Europe and North America allows the Norse settlement to flourish for hundreds of years and support thousands of people.
And yet, the last definitive evidence that we have of the Viking Greenlanders is the record of a marriage in 1408. After 1408, they just seem to disappear from history. And archaeologically, what we see are the ruins of their homes, ruins of barns, ruins of churches. But the people, they've disappeared.
What could cause an entire people to seemingly vanish from the face of the earth? Danish archaeologists Jan Melgaard and Knud Krogh investigate a Viking cemetery at Bratteli in the eastern settlement. Could it reveal any clues?
Melgaard and Krogh excavate, and they find lots of orderly burials, as they would expect, but then they found one that was very shocking. It was a mass grave. When they examined the skulls, they found that 5 of the individuals had been struck by sharp blades.
We can quite clearly see what must be lethal sword or axe lesions, which leads to the conclusion that they were probably all felled in battle.
Does that give us a clue as to what happened to the Vikings on Greenland? Was this the start or the simmering of a civil war? How long could that kind of war sustain? Do you kind of write your own obituary there?
If this theory that these individuals were evidence for the demise of the Viking settlement in Greenland, one would have to assume they'd match up to the date of around the 1400s, when the settlement is thought to have ended.
But Melgaard and Krogh have a problem.
At the time of the excavation in the 1960s, you can't directly date the human remains themselves.
By the 1980s, an accurate method has developed: radiocarbon dating. Professor Niels Linerup takes up where Melgaard and Krogh left off.
One of the things we worked a lot with human skeletal material from Greenland was trying to date the skeletons. Being able to fit how these skeletons fits with the general picture of the history of the Greenland settlement.
Professor Linerup radiocarbon dates the skeletons from the mass grave.
The radiocarbon datings of the individuals in the mass grave clearly show that they were from the early period of the settlement period.
These individuals are killed around the year 1000, and the Vikings lasted on Greenland for centuries after.
Whatever caused these violent deaths, it was too early to have caused the downfall of the entire settlement.
But could they have faced a threat not from within, but from outside their settlements? Perhaps from a foreign enemy. A major clue comes from the medieval manuscript, The History of Norway.
The history of Norway describes a group of people that the Vikings called the Skraelings, which roughly translates to wretched people.
It's not a compliment. We have a few records from the Norse side, and they're all about conflict. This year, some of the Greenlanders were killed, others were taken away. It's not friendly.
An account from a Greenland Viking says how the Skraelings come to the Western settlement.
In the mid-1300s, Ivar Bardason is sent by members of the Eastern settlement to check on things in the Western settlement.
And from his description, he says that there were no one left in the settlement when he arrived.
They found animals wandering around, but no humans left alive. So now the Skraelings have it. And the implication was that there was a massacre. The Western settlement's probably gone by the mid-14th century, 1350, somewhere in that time period.
Historical documentation clearly suggests that a foreign people have destroyed the Western settlement. But is there any truth to it? When the Vikings first arrive in Greenland in the year 985, they encounter no indigenous population. But archaeologists now believe that in 1200, a group of Proto-Inuit people, known as the Tuli, crossed from Canada into northern Greenland. These are the people that the Vikings refer to as the Skraelings. And they're considered to be the ancestors of all modern Inuit. They rapidly expand south towards the Vikings. The Tuli are expert hunters in this Arctic environment. Their hunting techniques are so successful that modern Inuit use them continuously well into the 20th century, as seen here in rare footage from 1922 of their hunting practices.
The Tuli developed techniques to exploit whatever food resources were available even in the dead of winter. Hooded seal would need to pop up in holes in the ice to breathe. When the seal popped up, the Tuli would be ready and waiting with spears and lassos.
Rather than hunting communally, like the Vikings, the Tuli developed technologies and techniques that allow them to hunt individually or in small groups and all year round. Their methods of hunting on land and ice are far safer than the Vikings, who carry out all their seal hunting by boat on the dangerous Arctic seas. The Tuli need far less communal organization and outlay than the Vikings to survive the harsh Greenland winters. By 1300, they'd reached the Western settlement, and by 1400, the Eastern settlement. Are the Greenland Vikings wiped out by advancing Inuit warriors? The discovery of the ruins of a Viking barn proves key to unlocking the mystery. Professor Thomas H. McGovern is an archaeologist and member of NABO, the North Atlantic Biocultural Organization, an elite group devoted to unlocking the archaeological mysteries of the cold North Atlantic.
Back in the 1970s, we had the opportunity to work on projects in the Western settlement. And one of the projects took us to this inland farm. And this is a site where we had an unexcavated house complex. So we were able to go down to the top and excavate it very systematically.
The discovery was a golden opportunity to actually get a close look as to what happened here and whether the Skraelings may indeed have been responsible for the demise of the Western settlement.
As the team excavate, they uncover something surprising. Wood from the roof of the farmhouse.
And you remember, in a North Atlantic situation, wood is very scarce, and it's very precious. When a house is abandoned, it's stripped of wood very rapidly. So the fact that we were finding everything in place, but just collapsed downwards, was a real shock.
If the Viking occupants of the Western settlement had left in an orderly fashion, they would have taken this wood with them.
We did a number of radiocarbon dates on the site, and they all clustered in the mid-14th century, 1350. So this actually is pretty close to the estimate you get from Ivar Bardson.
Did the Tuli kill the Vikings and destroy the Western settlement, like Ivar Bardsson's 14th century report suggests? Is the ancient apocalypse of the Greenland Vikings due to a foreign invasion? McGovern searches for evidence of an attack.
One of the things you expect to see is evidence of burning, because a classic way of attacking a northern house is to set on fire, but we haven't seen that.
If the settlement was attacked and its people killed, there should be signs of conflict. But McGovern finds none. It appears the Tuli didn't destroy the Western settlement after all. Instead, what McGovern uncovers are the skeletal remains of calves, lambs, and a large hunting dog.
We have a situation where in multiple sites in the Western settlement, dog skeletons are found in the uppermost layers. So something's going on at the very end there.
It's a highly unusual find. Why are there so many animal skeletons inside this Viking home? A closer analysis of the bones reveals something disturbing. Cattle and sheep are primarily used by the Norse Greenlanders for making milk, cheese, and yogurt. But these remains show signs they were butchered.
You're looking here at evidence of things like cut marks on the bone surface. And right outside the larder where the remains of the chopped up cows were found was a piece of at least one of these big dogs. So it looks as though this is an animal which didn't just die a natural death there.
These animals were killed, and killed for one reason alone: food.
From the standpoint of a farmer, this is a real disaster, because if you eat all your domestic animals now, you will not have them later in the year. There's no indication that the dog was on the menu on a regular basis. You know, these are animals you depend upon for hunting. These are animals you depend upon for your own survival. And if you destroy them, you won't survive for another year. That suggests an emergency situation.
These people were starving and desperate, prioritizing their immediate survival over any thoughts of their future. The Vikings had lived prosperously at the Western settlement for over 350 years. What could have changed so dramatically that these people were now starving? For McGovern, his work hasn't answered the question about why the Greenland Vikings disappeared. Without an exceptional discovery, it appears the Greenland Vikings will remain lost in the mists of history. McGovern's investigation gets a boost from an unlikely location, 3 kilometers beneath the surface of Greenland. Starting in 1988, a massive scientific project is undertaken on the Greenland ice sheet.
The Greenland Ice Sheet Project 2 sees scientists going about 1,200 kilometres north of the Western settlement onto the Greenland ice sheet to drill cores up to 3 kilometres deep. And by analysing that kind of apple core of ice, they can determine climactic changes from the deep past.
Each year, frozen water settles on the ice sheet and builds up in layers over time. By analysing the changes in the chemical structure of the ice year on year, scientists can build a picture of the history of the climate over the last 100,000 years. Could they give any clues for why the Western settlement was abandoned and for the wider Greenland Viking collapse? From the year 950 to 1250, the ice core analysis shows something surprising.
The climate during the early period of the Norse occupation was probably warmer. You probably had a more favorable set of seasons, say shorter winters, more precipitation in summertime.
This is known as the medieval warm period. For the Vikings in Greenland, it enabled them to get a foothold on what would otherwise have been a very barren and inhospitable land.
But these warm temperatures wouldn't last. Overcast skies with little sunlight isn't unusual for the Vikings on Greenland. But in 1257, they increase. Ash spewed into the atmosphere from a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia blocks sunlight across the globe. Temperatures around the world drop. It is catastrophic for conditions in the already freezing Greenland. Summers begin to get shorter, winters longer and colder, and the seas get much rougher.
The conditions at sea get worse and worse. There are more glacial icebergs, storms also increase. It's a lot more hazardous sailing between Greenland and Norway.
The frequency and severity of these cold periods accelerate through the mid-1300s until by the 1400s, the climate becomes incredibly cold and harsh. Average temperatures across Greenland plummet by up to 4 degrees Celsius. The drop is so severe that a glacier close to the western settlement grows by 15 kilometers. It is known as the Little Ice Age and lasts until the mid-1800s.
There's a really severe cold spike in the mid-14th century. As far as we can tell, this is one of the coldest spikes in approximately an 800-year period.
It would be disastrous for Viking farming.
It's going to affect the grass growth you need to produce the fodder for your animals. It's going to affect the length of time the snow lies in the ground.
The rapid increase in severe winters in the 1300s lines up perfectly with the evidence of abandonment of the Western settlement in Greenland. And it paints a picture in the run-up to that final historical record of the marriage in 1408.
It's a major climate clue that would indicate not only why the Greenland Vikings ate their own animals, but also why they might have to leave the Western settlement. But was there evidence that the Eastern settlement also suffered a fatal change in climate?
The Eastern settlement has some of the most favorable conditions in Greenland. It's far away from the icy wasteland to the north. So it's protected from the elements. It's got better soil. This is their agricultural heartland.
Paleoclimatologists search for clues at the bottom of a lake 9 kilometers from the Eastern settlement.
Lakes are wonderful for reconstructing the past climate because they're essentially just big sediment traps.
Sediment, washed into the water, settles on the lake bed and builds up in layers over time.
That means we have a reconstruction that goes back in history. So the further down we drill into the sediments in this lake, the further we go back in time.
Paleoclimatologist Tobias Schneider examines a sediment core sample drilled from the lake near the Eastern settlement. By analyzing the chemical makeup of each layer or year, Schneider can get a detailed view of the climate stretching back hundreds of years. Did a change in the climate cause the Viking settlement here to collapse, like it did at the Western settlement? Schneider examines the sediment core sample for traces of leaf waxes. plants that grow around the lake have a waxy coating covering their leaves. When the plants die, traces of these waxes find their way into the lake sediment. Stored in the chemical makeup of the leaf waxes is a history of the climate.
Plants build a waxy layer on the leaves to protect the leaves from evaporation and moisture loss. These leaf waxes are made from hydrogen from the water that they drink. When the plant is exposed to evaporation, water containing the lighter isotopes will evaporate first, and the heavier water will stay back in the plant.
Schneider analyzes the sample for the types of hydrogen isotopes stored in the leaf waxes over time. What he discovers is startling. From the year 950 until the 1500s, there is a steady decrease in lighter hydrogen isotopes. Across this period, there is more evaporation, but also, crucially, less rainfall. By 1400, towards the end of the Viking occupation of Greenland, the eastern settlement is in drought.
Less rainfall would have been devastating for the Greenland Vikings. It would have unraveled their entire way of life. Long winters, and with less rainfall, they can't grow animal feed. They can't raise cattle and sheep and goats, which means they have no food to eat, and it's becoming harder and harder to survive.
It's a huge step closer to unlocking the mystery. But there's a problem. The Tuli managed to survive the changing climate. So successfully that today 90% of Greenlanders count Tuli heritage. So how come they survive, but the Greenland Vikings don't? What is it that leads them to disappear from history? Around the time of the Viking collapse on Greenland, a disease rips through Europe, plunging the continent into chaos. The Black Death.
From 1347 to around 1351, waves of a bubonic plague known as the Black Death swept across Europe and killed millions of people. In Norway, the plague kills about half the population, and in Iceland, the impact is enormous as well.
The Greenland Vikings were plugged into a trade network with Iceland and Norway. Ships carrying iron would dock in the eastern settlement and return with their hulls laden with walrus tusks. These traders would make ideal hosts for the plague.
One person with the plague can very rapidly spread it to every household on Greenland. That's very likely a reason for a whole settlement to die.
But does the Black Death reach neighboring Greenland?
Archaeological investigations across burial grounds shows that the Black Death never reached Greenland.
It seems the Greenland Vikings are able to survive this catastrophic event. But the Black Death doesn't have to infect the Viking population here to have a dire effect on the settlement.
Once Norway was overtaken by the Black Death, the demand for ivory just drops. Most people are thinking, we've got to build back society from the ground up, and luxury items like ivory were just no longer in demand.
Add onto this the onset of the Little Ice Age, and as temperatures begin to fall, seas become rougher.
Obviously, when there is a demand for ivory tusks, people are prepared to risk it. But suddenly, that journey becomes a lot less tempting and a lot more dangerous.
In time, Northern Europe recovers from the Black Death. Culture, trade, and science flourishes. But carved walrus ivory would never come back in favor. The desire to trade with Greenland stops. Less walrus ivory is being collected, and crucially, fewer essential supplies, like iron, are making their way into the settlements. And even rougher seas make the trip to Newfoundland to harvest trees too dangerous. The supply of wood dries up. Their economy collapses. With the climate worsening, the Greenland Vikings have the odds heavily stacked against them. Their whole way of life, their very survival, is under threat. Professor Niels Linnerup believes that the collapse of the economy and the worsening climate could have led to a mass exodus of people from Greenland.
I always try to imagine the old farmer in Norse Greenland standing on a hill and looking over his farm and saying to his young son, "Now look, son, one day all this will be yours." And what he sees is a run-down farm with only a few scrangy animals. And he's like, "Right, Dad, I'm off." So when the next ship comes, he's off to Norway or Iceland.
With Norway and Iceland recovered from the Black Death, they're ideal places to live. This depopulation would have severe consequences for those who remain. While there is no written evidence of a great migration, Linnerup believes that even a slow trickle of people leaving Greenland would be equally disastrous.
If a young couple leaves once in a while, at first it doesn't really register. But at some point, not only would it mean that two people have left, it also means they've taken out the potential for children. So 10, 20 years later, you suddenly realize, wow, you know, we're only maybe 500 people left, very few young people left.
The Greenland Vikings have built their society on the idea of a chieftain surrounded by people, and every one of those people is vital for the survival of the homestead. The fewer men there are, the fewer seals that they can actually hunt and collect and bring back. And people are bound to go hungry. More and more people are going to leave because it's hard, and then it gets harder, so more and more people leave.
The Greenland Vikings would be right on the edge of extinction. All they would need is one final push. Analysis of the ice core samples taken during the Greenland Ice Sheet Project 2 reveals a small change that gives a major clue. The samples, drilled over 1,400 kilometers inland from the eastern settlement, show a steady increase in sea salt from the year 1200 onwards. More seawater is blowing inland and settling on the ice sheet. It indicates rougher seas around Greenland with more frequent and severe storms. Then, in 1425, there is a major spike in salt. It is a close match to the last known record from the Greenland Vikings, the marriage in 1408. In this period of the early 1400s, the sea is getting more and more dangerous.
Their farms are failing. They have no other option but to go and hunt seal for survival now. This is how they're getting their main source of meat.
With a diminished population, all it would take to finish off the Greenland Vikings is one particularly bad storm, while a communal seal hunt is taking place.
The sorts of boats we're talking about is something called the six-sword boat. They could be very fast, but they also could capsize easily. Doesn't get a lot of people killed. Is a catastrophic storm that comes just at the wrong time and drowns a whole lot of people. What you're really seeing is the loss of almost all of your active adults, and the folks who are left are old people and sick people and children.
With the principal food getters gone, the remaining Vikings would face a bleak future and a very desperate ending. Archaeologists can't be sure exactly when the Greenland Vikings finally perished. But what they are sure about is that after hundreds of years on Greenland, these people, in the end, could no longer survive. A brutal change in climate, both on land and sea, a collapse in their economy, and a final, debilitating exodus. It is a vicious circle, leading only to one thing: the end of the Greenland Vikings. But one critical question remains.
Modern Greenlanders display a 90% genetic similarity to the native Tuli peoples. Modern Greenlanders are, by and large, direct descendants of the Tuli people.
Greenland's Inuit population carried on the traditional Tuli way of life well into the 20th century. Where the Vikings perished, the Tuli lived on. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Vikings chose not to adopt any technologies or techniques that the Tuli used to survive for thousands of years in harsh Arctic environments. So in order to survive, why did the Vikings not copy their Tuli neighbors?
This is a community dominated by its chieftains, dominated by its elites. It's by no means an egalitarian community.
Fundamentally, that level of strict hierarchical society quashes creativity and innovation. There's not that much opportunity to think of a different way of doing things and then enact it without incurring the wrath of your community, without sort of stepping out of your lane and then being chastised for it.
Innovation that didn't directly advance the Vikings' ivory harvesting, seal hunting, or farming is discouraged. And all of these were communal events. As the climate changed and their farms failed, the Vikings adapted by upping their seal hunting. But they still chose to hunt as they always had, communally. And the seal migration only occurs twice a year.
The pressure on the hunt in the Viking model in Greenland would have been intense. Effectively, the Vikings allow themselves only one shot to secure enough food to see their population through a long winter.
It's very different to the way the Tuli hunted, which had proved so successful for millennia.
There are a number of technological practices that the Greenland Vikings could have adopted from their Tuli neighbours. Things like harpooning seals through the ice and then pulling them up, which ensures a supply of meat throughout the year.
The Tuli also hunted individually to provide just for their family, rather than their entire community, as the Vikings did.
I think fundamentally, the Vikings didn't want to do that. They could have adopted all those practices. It is possible that some people said, we're going to do that. We're just going to go native, as it were. But I think for a lot of other Vikings, that just would have been inconceivable. It would have been too much of a cultural gear shift, a handbrake turn, if you will.
The Vikings didn't adapt their way of life outside their very narrow viewpoint, even with a solution staring them in the face, namely the Tuli, or Inuit, way of life. What had helped the Vikings to grow on Greenland, their communal, pastoral way of life, in the end, became their Achilles heel. As Greenland changed, the Greenland Vikings weren't able to change with it, and they paid the ultimate price.